Hi, everyone. This week, we're going to talk about how to use language successfully when it comes to your speeches and keeping lots of things in mind in terms of how language can help elevate your speech and engage more with the audience, and how sometimes it can also be used in negative ways to distance your audience and make people feel bad. So, I want to start with a few, at least in the United States, very famous speeches. The first one is by Patrick Henry. He was one of the founding fathers and the former governor of Virginia. And when they were trying to decide what to do about Britain, whether they were going to go to war or try to do it peacefully, part of his speech, which is very famous, says this: "Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." This was actually such a powerful speech at the time that the people ended up agreeing with him, and it became the start of the American Revolution. Another famous speech by Abraham Lincoln was the one that he gave in the Gettysburg Address, which starts, "407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal." Now, while obviously there's some challenges with some of the wording in this day and age, at the time and still, it is a beautiful piece of speech that shows so much emotion and really spoke to the heart of the American people at the time as he tried to coalesce an entire nation around the fact that so many people had given their life in that place. And the last one is by Sojourner Truth, who was born in slavery, was an abolitionist and a women's rights movement beginner. And it says here, that man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any place. And ain't I a woman? So again, with this speech, she allows the audience to question their own values, their own belief system by recognizing that, yes, of course she's a woman. And why is it that because of the color of her skin, she is being treated differently than other women? So these are some examples of how language can be so powerful that can ultimately actually change the course of history. So let's talk about how to make your language really powerful, maybe not at such lofty levels, but perhaps so someday, so that when you do give your speech, it brings the power and the gravitas to it that you want to get your message across. So the first thing that you want to make sure of when you're thinking about what makes language so important is the meaning. And in thinking about this, there are two things that I want you to consider. There's a difference between what's known as the denotative meaning of a word and something that's known as the connotative meaning of the word. Now, denotative, it says here accepted meaning of the word. Think of this as what you would find in the dictionary. If you look up the word bat in a dictionary, you're either going to see a small winged animal or you're going to see something that gets used in baseball, normally made out of wood. Now, when you're thinking about speech, the only thing you have to be aware of when you're talking about something is if a word can have lots of different meanings, as in the case of bat, that the audience understands that you're talking about the baseball bat and not the animal bat. Now, connotative meaning is a little bit different. It's a personal or cultural response to a word. So in this case, if I'd had some sort of experience when I was a child and was mortally afraid of bats, then I'm going to have an emotional response to somebody using the word bat. And in my case, it's going to be a negative response, right? Because I'm afraid of it because of my experience. Now that's personal, right? Whatever my personal meaning of that word could change how I hear it in context. But there are also cultural responses to words. There are cultural meanings that we associate to things, especially if I say to somebody, "You are such a snake." Now, obviously, I'm not saying you're this little animal that slithers on the ground. In the cultural perspective of what snake means, we tend to think of it as somebody who's a little sneaky. If I say someone's a rat, it tends to mean that they are somebody who might snitch on somebody or not keep secrets. So we have a lot of different connotative meanings of words, and when you're giving a speech, you have to be very aware of what the connotative meanings of word might be. Obviously, you can't always know what personal connotations are, but you want to be aware of some of those cultural connotations and ensure that you're not offending anybody in the course of using some of that language. Another thing that we want to talk about, I'm going to show you a quick video that is a combination of thinking about connotative and denotative meaning, as well as stereotype language, which we're going to look at as well a little bit later. This was a commercial that always did during the Super Bowl called Like a Girl. And what I want you to do is watch the commercial and then consider what is the difference between the connotative meaning of like a girl and the denotative meaning of like a girl as they're showing it in the commercial.
Hi, Erin. Show me what it looks like to run like a girl.
My hair.
Show me what it looks like to fight like a girl. Now throw like a girl.
Aw.
So do you think you just insulted your sister?
No. I mean, yeah, insulted girls, but not my sister.
My name is Dakota, and I'm 10 years old.
Show me what it looks like to run like a girl. Throw like a girl. Fight like a girl. What does it mean to you when I say run like a girl?
It means run fast as you can.
So what was the difference between the connotation and denotation, or connotative and denotative meaning of running like a girl? Now, obviously, from a denotative meaning, run like a girl just means to run in a normal way, except that you're running as a girl. Whereas connotatively, our society has taken on this idea of what it means so that it can mean something negative as girls get older. And this is the power that language has that we have to be really aware of, because it can change, as you see in that video, the perception that we as a society have of different groups of people. And I will show you again in the next video how this can tend to be really detrimental to different groups of people and individuals. So what makes language so important is also in terms of power. So you see here the word terrorist. Now, as soon as you saw that word on the screen, you probably had a mental image that came into your head. I won't ask you what that mental image is. What I would ask you is to think about where that mental image comes from. Does it come from the fact that you know anyone? No, probably not. It comes from the narratives that you've heard through video, through media, through newspapers, that has arrived at your idea of what this word means, and quite frankly, in many cases, who it means when you hear it. And this is the danger sometimes and the power that language can have. So you want to be aware of it. And I'm going to show you some really depressing and sad visions of things that people have been told in terms of what people see of them or think of them when they don't actually know people at an individual level, but they think of people in terms of stereotypes. So there's a young gentleman who's been told, "You're not like the other black people I know. You speak so well." This trans woman who said, "You're so beautiful for a trans girl." And this Asian girl who's been told, "But you all look alike." Now, these are terrible things to say to people, because underneath each of those things are stereotypes that we are putting on people because of narratives that we've been told and fed through society that don't actually take into account individual people and what they are and who they are without these layers of negative connotations. So I want you to take a minute, to think about, what are some of the things that people have told you in your life that they said because they didn't know you as an individual, but because of some of the language about who you are at some level that made them have connotative meanings of who you are and what you bring to the table? I'm sure that we all have them, right? Every time I do this face-to-face, I'm always inordinately depressed at hearing some of the things that my students come up with in terms of some of the things that people have said to them. And it runs the gamut, no matter who the student is, where they're from, what their background is, what gender they are, what sexual orientation, what race, what religion. Everyone has had some example of somebody making some gross generalizations about us as individuals without getting to know us because of some connotation that's been imposed on them because of the media, because of our societal language. So it's something that I want you all to be very aware of, not only in your speech when it comes to public speaking, but in everyday life, to break down some of those barriers and make sure that we're not doing to others the kinds of things that we don't want to have done unto us. How can you use language effectively? Besides power and meaning, you also want to be specific. You want to be concrete with your language. If I say the person saved the child, that doesn't really evoke anything. If I say Mrs. Epps saved the infant from the burning car, it's a little bit better, but it's still not quite good enough. The more specific you can make the language, the more you can plant a picture in someone's head, the more that they can live the experience, the more effective that story and that language is going to have. One of the things I always say in my classes when it comes to storytelling or speeches is show me, don't tell me, show me. So don't tell me that the person saved the child, make me imagine it. Say there it was, the child, Bobby, was sitting in the front seat of the car when all of a sudden the car was engulfed in flames. And before you know it, Mrs. Epps came screaming out of her house and saw that this infant was mere seconds away from being overwhelmed by all those flames. And she rushed to, I'm not going to continue, but you get the idea that as soon as you have this picture in your mind of where that infant is and what's happening to the car and where Mrs. Epps is, then it's a much more solidified image in your head that's going to help you connect to the language and the story more emotionally and have a more lasting impact. You also want to eliminate unnecessary words. Now, obviously, we just talked about being concrete, but you also want to make sure that you're not adding any language that is there just to fill pauses or because you don't necessarily know what else to say. We mentioned this a little bit when we were talking more about body language in a different week, but remember that there's a lot of power in pausing, that power is never rushed, and there's nothing wrong with sometimes taking your time and allowing that silence to take shape. The other thing in terms of specificity is to avoid cliches like the plague, their old hat. Now, these are both fairly old cliches. Like the plague, obviously, if you think back to the plague of any time in history, this the idea of something that we don't want, right? So you want to avoid it like something that is really not something that you want. And their old hat means that there's something that are outdated. Now, some of you probably didn't even know what these cliches were, which just goes to prove the point that you want to be careful because every language has their own cliches. And even if you are native in that particular language, you might know different cliches than other people based on your own generation, on what your culture is internally, and where you're from. So ideally, you come up with other language to express yourself in a more meaningful way than trying to take cliches. You also want to make sure that when you use your language effectively, you're appropriate. The language should suit you, the audience, and the situation. So what do I mean by suiting you? It means that it should be language that's the kind of language you would use every day. Now remember that a good speaker is just the same person that people would meet in a normal setting, just a more polished version of you. So if you start coming up and using language that maybe is a little esoteric or using big 10-cent words that aren't really who you are, then you're just going to come across as inauthentic, and that's not going to help you engage well with the audience. You also want the language to suit the audience. If I say something like, if I'm talking about ballet to a group of people that knows nothing about ballets, and I start talking about the entrechat and the arabesque, and the audience has no idea what that is, then all I'm doing is making the audience feel like they can't quite connect to what I'm talking about, which is going to make it more difficult for me to get my message across. And lastly, the situation. If you're talking to a group of kids or you're talking in a situation where you're at a football game, maybe the language is going to be suited differently than if you're talking to a group of people in a professional setting. So you have to be aware of both yourself, the audience, and the situation in terms of how the language should suit. You also want to make sure to use culturally unbiased language. We talked this a little bit before, so I'm not going to beat a dead horse, ha, to use a cliche, but you want to avoid singling irrelevant personal traits or characteristics. You want to use the name for an individual group that they prefer. You also want to be aware of things like generational differences. You know, if somebody says, "Oh man, Roger Federer, he's a really great tennis player," if they say Roger Federer is the GOAT, if you're a certain age group, people understand exactly what you mean. But if you're a different age group, they might think that you're insulting Roger Federer and calling him some type of animal. So you want to be aware of using language that's not just cultural and set in place in terms of where you are, where you're from, but cultural can also be generational. It can be part of a school system, part of a family, and you just want to be aware that the language that you're using is appropriate for the group that you find yourself in. You also want to make sure to avoid using stereotypical language. If I say that if I say woman driver, right, that's not only stereotypical, it's also connotative. It's just like saying like a girl. Woman driver, if I say, has the connotation in the United States of being a bad driver. Redneck has connotations in our language that may or may not be true. Mr. Mom, right, is somebody, maybe a father who takes care of the kids. That's also extremely stereotypical and not a nice thing to say. So you have to find language that you want to express a certain way, you want to be specific, but you also don't want to be stereotypical in the way that you use it. And lastly, of course, also using gender neutral language. So, you know, saying firefighter instead of fireman, or when I was growing up, we used to talk about airline stewardess, but now it's a flight attendant because it's gender neutral. So you want to be aware of all those different things. When I remember when my kids were coming home from school one day and they said to me, "Can we please sit crisscross applesauce?" And I said, "What in the world does that mean?" And they showed me sitting cross-legged. And before I even thought about it, I started saying, "Oh, you mean sitting Indian style?" And then I realized, oh my goodness, that was a language that I grew up with, and that was stereotypical language that was being unfair to Native American people in this country, and that is why, thankfully, our culture changed it so that my kids are not growing up with that. But it's something we have to constantly be aware of the language that we're using in the society that we find ourselves, that sometimes feeds us these narratives that might not always be correct. Ignorance and assumptions. So one of the other things that we want to be aware of oftentimes when it comes to culture is some of the ignorance and assumptions that we make and the things that we hear that can be really inappropriate. So I'm going to show you a video which is humorous in the way that it's trying to come across, but also has a larger message in it. So I'm going to take a minute to show you what this video is.
Hi there.
Hi.
Nice day, huh?
Yeah, finally, right?
Where are you from? Your English is perfect.
San Diego. We speak English there.
Oh, no. Where are you from?
Well, I was born in Orange County, but I never actually lived there.
I mean before that.
Before I was born.
Yeah, like, where are your people from?
Well, my great-grandma was from Seoul.
Korean. I knew it. I was like, she's either Japanese or Korean. But I was leaning more towards Korean.
Amazing.
Yeah. Hamshasina. There's a really good teriyaki barbecue place near my apartment. So I actually really like kimchi.
Cool. What about you? Where are you from?
San Francisco.
But where are you from?
Oh, I'm just American.
Really? You're Native American?
No, just regular American. Oh, well, I guess my grandparents are from England.
Oh, well. Hello, Governor! What's all this then? Top of the morning to you. Let's get a small tea. Double, toil and trouble. Mind the gap! Beware, Jack the Ripper! Bloody hell! Pip pip! Cheerio! I think your people's fish and chips are amazing.
You're weird.
Really? I'm weird? Must be a Korean thing.
Now, my guess is that gentleman did not set out to be, well, he probably set out to be ignorant. He probably did not set out to be offensive. And yet his assumptions and ignorance made him come out as offensive. And so you want to always be aware that sometimes we don't always know it, but it can come across that way. And I also want to take a moment to talk a little bit about accents, because I often have students in my classes that come from lots of different parts of the world. And sometimes they're a little bit nervous when they have to give a speech in a language that's not their native language. A lot of times because they assume that because of their accent, either people will have a hard time hearing them or they won't come across in the way they want to. And I want to dispel some of those assumptions right away and say that, believe it or not, studies have shown that when people speak with accents, it actually makes people pay more attention than they normally would. Why? Well, because we're wired to pay attention to difference and to change. And so if somebody starts speaking and they have this interesting accent, then we tend to lean in and listen more attentively. So that's one piece of good news. The other piece of good news is that oftentimes when people speak with an accent, they tend to think at times that they're not coming across in a way that makes them seem as intelligent as they are. And yet, studies again show that people think of them as more intelligent because they have an accent. Because what people are thinking is, wow, not only are you giving a speech about this topic, which is already impressive, but you're giving it in a language that's not your own, which just heightens people's sense that you have confidence and ability to speak well about the topic. So if you're all worried about an accent, I want you to try to dispel that. The one thing I will tell you is that especially Americans are notoriously fairly bad at understanding accents. So whether English is your native language or not, something that's really helpful when you're speaking is to clearly enunciate all of your words so that people can better understand each one and keep up with you. So how can you boost your distinctiveness using vivid language? This is the last thing I want to talk about, which kind of wraps everything together. Once you're aware of things like the stereotypes and making sure you're not using culturally or gender biased language, you want to use vivid language that I says helps people to show and see what it is that you're talking about rather than just saying it. And you can use all of your senses to do that. So make people see it, smell it, taste it, hear it, touch it. The sharp edge of the paper cut my finger and made it sting is a much better way of saying that than I hurt my finger. If I say the sweet smell of freshly baked apple filled the air, well, if you've ever had a baked apple, you probably have a sense of it now. In fact, studies show that if you say the word velvet or coffee, and you've ever had coffee and you like it, or you've touched velvet, your same part of your brain will light up that actually lights up when you touch the velvet or when you drink the coffee. So the ability to use vivid language not only boosts your distinctiveness, but actually really helps you to connect with your audience much better. So as you're preparing your speech in the coming weeks, keep these things in mind to make sure that when you do speak, your language helps you to connect with your audience and to help you come across in more positive ways to show them exactly what it is that you're trying to explain to get them to be persuaded and informed more effectively.